What if I told you that the biggest streaming giant on the planet now feels it was duped? That Netflix, the company that handed Meghan Markle and Prince Harry a deal worth upwards of $100 million, now claims they were manipulated, misled, and ultimately betrayed? Imagine it. The very platform that gave the Sussexes the loudest megaphone in the world is now quietly admitting, behind the polished walls of Hollywood power, that the story wasn't what they thought they bought. It almost feels cinematic, doesn't it? The glamorous couple who stormed away from the monarchy, sold their story to the world, and basked in international attention. But what happens when their new kingdom, Hollywood itself, begins to question whether they were telling the truth? What happens when Ted Sarandos, Netflix's boss, a man who rarely breaks his silence, allegedly looks at colleagues and utters the words, "They lied to us. We were misled"? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The truth, or at least the perception of truth, is the currency of both monarchy and Hollywood. One deals in tradition and legacy, the other in entertainment and narrative. And Meghan and Harry tried to straddle both worlds, trading their royal connections for Hollywood power. But now, the cracks are showing. And if those cracks widen, the empire they built could come tumbling down faster than anyone ever imagined. Think about this. When the Sussexes signed with Netflix in 2020, it was hailed as the streaming coup of the decade. Harry and Meghan had just announced their departure from royal duties, stunning the world. Tabloids roared, palaces whispered, and Netflix swooped in, offering them a stage to tell their side. The headlines screamed about the Megxit million-dollar deal, and the couple became the poster children for Hollywood reinvention. But let's pause. Doesn't something feel ironic now? Back then, Netflix believed they had secured not just celebrity content, but a cultural moment, a chance to be at the center of history. Today, Sarandos' reported comments suggest they no longer feel they bought history, they bought spin. And in the entertainment world, spin without substance is dangerous. Now, why does this matter today? Because Netflix's disappointment is not just about Meghan and Harry. It's about credibility. Streaming platforms live and die on the trust of their subscribers. If audiences feel duped, if they believe documentaries aren't grounded in truth, what happens to that trust? And if Meghan and Harry can't be trusted by Netflix, how can they be trusted by Hollywood, by sponsors, by the public? That's the iceberg beneath the surface here. So here's the question for you. Do you think Netflix executives were naive? Or do you believe Meghan and Harry deliberately manipulated the narrative to serve themselves? Hold that thought, because as this story unravels, the evidence grows more damning. But before we dive into the fallout, let's zoom in on Ted Sarandos himself. He's not your typical Hollywood loudmouth. He's calm, reserved, strategic, known for being Netflix's steady hand. Rarely does he go off-script or show personal frustration. So when whispers began circulating that he said, "They lied to us," the weight of those words shook Hollywood. If he meant them, it wasn't a slip. It was calculated. And calculated silence breaking? That always means something bigger is at play. Now imagine the boardroom conversations. Early meetings full of excitement. Staff convinced this Sussex partnership would rival the crown in cultural impact. Now fast forward to executives poring over documents, fact-checking claims, and discovering, allegedly, that key parts of the story may not hold up under scrutiny. Betrayal isn't just about money. It's about reputation. And for Netflix, that's priceless. But here's what makes it even juicier. Meghan and Harry didn't just sell a documentary. They sold a brand, a promise. They marketed themselves as truth-tellers breaking free from royal shackles. Their entire brand hinges on authenticity, that the monarchy silenced them, and now, finally, they would speak openly. But if Netflix now believes that very authenticity was manufactured, then everything else begins to collapse. Archwell, their charity, their public speaking, their Hollywood partnerships, all of it rests on the credibility of their narrative. And let's not forget the audience. The people who binged the series, cried during Meghan's revelations, felt outrage at Harry's descriptions of palace life. What happens to them if Netflix admits it was all exaggerated? Audiences don't like to feel foolish. Betrayal burns hotter when millions feel complicit. And Sarandos knows this. His alleged words weren't just for the industry. They were a warning shot to the world. Don't be fooled again. But here's the twist. Netflix doesn't want to look like a victim. This is a company that thrives on power plays. So why let this leak at all? Why let whispers of "they lied to us" escape the boardroom? Because, perhaps, Netflix wants to distance itself from the Sussex brand without officially cutting ties. A silent PR game, signal to Wall Street and Hollywood that they won't be burned again, while still reaping whatever views the Sussex name can generate. Now, think about the irony. The royal family once accused Meghan and Harry of misrepresenting palace life. Critics accused them of exaggeration. Now, years later, Netflix executives echo the same frustration. Do you see the pattern here? Every institution they've aligned with eventually feels betrayed. The palace, the press, now Netflix. Who's next? And if you're thinking, well, maybe Netflix knew what it was getting into, consider this. Even in Hollywood, there are lines. Documentaries are supposed to balance storytelling with truth. If Netflix executives feel manipulated into delivering propaganda disguised as fact, that damages more than one brand. It tarnishes their own. And in an industry already rife with mistrust, Netflix can't afford that stain. So here we are, at the edge of a revelation that could shake both monarchy and Hollywood. Because this isn't just about whether Meghan and Harry exaggerated. It's about whether they can survive losing their biggest backers' trust. Imagine the headlines if Netflix walks away, or worse, openly criticizes them. Imagine the investors pulling funding, the sponsors hesitating, the Hollywood doors quietly closing. But here's the real kicker. Sarandos' words may only be the beginning. If executives feel betrayed, what's stopping them from leaking more? Internal documents, fact-check reports, private conversations with the Sussexes? The truth may not just come out, it may explode. And that brings us to the cliffhanger. Because as shocking as Sarandos' alleged remarks are, they're only the opening act of a much bigger drama. The cracks in the Sussex-Netflix partnership are just beginning to show. And what comes next could dismantle their entire Hollywood empire. And no one, not even Meghan and Harry themselves, may be able to stop it. It all began with a deal that shook the entertainment world and sent shockwaves through Buckingham Palace. A deal worth up to $100 million. A deal that promised not just television, but transformation. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex, fresh from their dramatic exit from royal duties, found themselves signing one of the most lucrative streaming contracts in history with Netflix. But here's the question that no one dared to ask at the time. Was it truly a golden opportunity or the beginning of a golden trap? Think back to 2020. The world was in turmoil. A global pandemic. A monarchy facing an identity crisis. And into the chaos stepped Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, with a narrative perfectly designed to captivate. They weren't just royals anymore. They were rebels. They were freedom fighters. They were victims of a centuries-old institution that they claimed had silenced them. Who wouldn't want to buy that story? Who wouldn't pay to hear the details? And Netflix did. In fact, Netflix didn't just buy their story, they banked on it. Executives saw dollar signs, subscriber spikes, headlines across the globe. To them, Harry and Meghan weren't just a couple. They were content gold. The kind of cultural lightning that doesn't strike often. But here's what you need to remember. Golden deals often come with hidden costs. Because while the headlines screamed about the Sussexes' $100 million payday, inside Netflix, expectations were set impossibly high. Sarandos and his team didn't just want content. They wanted a global phenomenon, the kind that would rival The Crown and outshine every other royal drama. Now ask yourself, was that expectation ever realistic? Could two people, even two royals, live up to such immense pressure? The hype was intoxicating. Meghan and Harry, finally free, finally able to speak. The world held its breath. Netflix rolled out the red carpet. Every whisper, every tease, every trailer dripped with promise. But behind closed doors, some Netflix insiders were already uneasy. The couple had charisma, yes. They had headlines, yes. But did they truly have a story? One that could sustain multiple shows, documentaries, and projects? Still, the contract was signed. The champagne corks popped. And Netflix pushed forward. They didn't just want to create a documentary. They wanted to define an era. An era where monarchy meets modernity. Where tradition collides with celebrity. Where the truth, raw and unfiltered, would be streamed to millions. But here's where it gets interesting. The very premise of that deal rested on trust. Trust that Meghan and Harry's story was genuine. Trust that the revelations would be groundbreaking. Trust that the Sussexes weren't just selling drama. but truth. And in Hollywood, where truth is often blurred, Netflix believed they were buying authenticity. And yet, from the beginning, warning signs appeared. Production delays, creative differences, rumors of clashes between Archwell and Netflix producers. At one point, insiders whispered that Netflix wondered whether the Sussexes even wanted to tell their story or simply wanted to control it. Do you see the contradiction? On one hand, Meghan and Harry promised to reveal everything. On the other, they wanted to dictate how it was revealed. For Netflix, this tension would prove deadly. Because here's the irony. The Sussexes' biggest selling point was their royal past. And yet, their deal was supposed to signal their royal future, a future as independent storytellers. But once the cameras rolled, the past dominated. The palace drama overshadowed every other angle. And while Netflix executives smiled publicly, behind the scenes they wondered, had they just bought 6 hours of rehashed royal gossip? But here's the punch. At first, it worked. When Harry and Meghan premiered, it smashed records. Tens of millions tuned in. Social media exploded. Netflix declared victory. But was it truly a victory? Or just the beginning of the end? Because here's what executives realized. Massive viewership doesn't always mean massive respect. Audiences were divided. Some called it heartbreaking. Others called it hypocritical. Critics questioned the accuracy. And while the Sussexes basked in the spotlight, Netflix executives began asking questions of their own. Questions like, did we overpay? Did we buy authenticity or propaganda? Did we secure global truth-tellers or global manipulators? And the tension only grew. For every glowing headline, there was a scathing review. For every emotional anecdote, there was a fact-check. And slowly, Netflix's golden deal began to lose its shine. So let me ask you, do you think Netflix knew exactly what they were getting? Or do you think, like many in the industry now whisper, they were played? Because here's the cliffhanger. In the boardrooms of Los Gatos, California, as Netflix staff replayed every claim, every accusation, every dramatic pause in the Sussex documentary, executives began to realize they may not have bought the truth at all. They may have bought a performance. And what they uncovered next would leave them stunned and set the stage for a backlash no one saw coming. When Netflix pressed play on the Sussex story, what they expected was a documentary masterpiece. What they got instead was a controversy that refuses to die. The project was supposed to be the crown jewel of their multimillion-dollar deal, a landmark cultural moment that would forever change how the world saw Meghan and Harry. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The promises didn't quite match the reality. And the fallout from that gap still haunts Netflix today. Let's rewind to the build-up. The marketing machine was relentless. Trailers teased dramatic revelations. Posters promised raw honesty. Meghan's tearful confessionals and Harry's sharp critiques of palace life were positioned as must-see television. Netflix wanted viewers to believe this wasn't just entertainment. It was history in the making. And for a brief moment, it worked. The documentary series, Harry and Meghan, debuted with massive viewership. Headlines declared it one of the most-watched docuseries in Netflix history. Millions binge-watched. Social media exploded with debates, defenses, and denunciations. On the surface, it looked like a win. But peel back the curtain, and you see the cracks. Almost immediately, critics pounced on inconsistencies. Scenes that were supposed to show intrusive paparazzi were revealed to feature footage from unrelated events. Alleged examples of press harassment didn't always line up with the narrative being told. Some claims, when fact-checked, appeared exaggerated, even misleading. Doesn't that strike you as strange? For a couple who insisted they were finally telling the whole truth, why did so many details feel selective? Inside Netflix, whispers began. While the Sussexes painted themselves as victims silenced by the monarchy, executives wondered, were they now silencing parts of the truth that didn't fit their story? A documentary, by definition, is supposed to document reality. But what happens when reality is bent into drama? And here's the irony. The show was a global hit, but not necessarily for the reasons Netflix wanted. People weren't tuning in purely for truth. They were tuning in for spectacle, for gossip, for palace intrigue. And that kind of attention is volatile. It burns bright, but fades fast. Worse, it risks damaging the credibility of the platform that streams it. Think about it. Netflix has built its empire on trust. Trust that when you press play, you'll get quality storytelling. Trust that their documentaries, even when sensational, have a foundation in fact. But the more audiences fact-checked Harry and Meghan, the more it seemed Netflix had sacrificed integrity for drama. And for Sarandos, that realization was catastrophic. Because what's worse than a flop? A hit that undermines your brand. Executives started to worry. Had they just produced propaganda disguised as documentary? Were they, in fact, being used by Meghan and Harry to push a one-sided agenda? The phrase that began circulating in internal circles was damning. We've been misled. Now, consider the position of Netflix at this moment. They'd invested millions. They'd promoted the project globally. They'd staked their reputation on the Sussexes. Pulling back wasn't an option. The deal was already done. But continuing meant embracing the growing backlash. And the backlash was real. Journalists dissected the series line by line. Royal experts went on air to challenge its claims. Even some fans admitted disappointment. The narrative that was supposed to liberate Meghan and Harry ended up raising more questions than it answered. So ask yourself, was this truly a documentary, or was it a carefully staged performance? Inside Netflix, frustration grew. Staffers who had once championed the Sussexes began to feel uneasy. Producers questioned whether the couple had withheld information, exaggerated events, or cherry-picked footage. One insider allegedly described the process as negotiating with actors, not subjects. That one line speaks volumes. And yet, despite the unease, the series stayed up. Why? Because Netflix knew controversy sells. And in Hollywood, scandal can be as profitable as sincerity. But for Ted Sarandos, the CEO whose brand rests on balancing profit with credibility, the dissonance was too much. He reportedly voiced what others only whispered. They lied to us. We were misled. A short sentence, but one that cut through the noise like a knife. If true, it signaled a seismic shift in how Netflix viewed its royal partners. Here's the twist, though. Even as the documentary racked up record numbers, the seed of doubt had been planted. For every subscriber gained, Netflix risked losing trust. For every headline about shocking revelations, there was another about factual errors. And Sarandos knew, credibility lost is hard to win back. So what happens when the very company that elevated Meghan and Harry begins to question them? What happens when a platform built on global influence starts to suspect it's been manipulated? That's the cliffhanger here. Because as damaging as public criticism can be, nothing is more devastating than private betrayal. And when Netflix began to sense it had been sold a one-sided narrative, the fallout inside the company became impossible to ignore. What came next would take the royal drama out of the palace and into Netflix's own boardrooms. Ted Sarandos doesn't speak often. And that's exactly why, when he does, the world pays attention. The man who turned Netflix from a DVD rental service into a global streaming empire has built his reputation on being measured, strategic, and above all, silent when others might shout. In Hollywood, where egos run wild and executives scramble for the spotlight, Sarandos has always played the opposite game. He rarely comments on celebrity drama. He rarely makes things personal. So when whispers began to circulate that he broke his silence on Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, people stopped in their tracks. Think about this. Sarandos is not some entertainment journalist chasing clicks. He's not a royal commentator trying to stay relevant. He is the gatekeeper of billions in content, the man who can make or break Hollywood careers with a single yes or no. And yet, in a rare moment of candor, he reportedly uttered words that reverberated through boardrooms, gossip columns, and palace walls alike. They lied to us. We were misled. Now pause for a second. Let that sink in. This wasn't a tabloid headline. This wasn't an anonymous source. This was, allegedly, the CEO himself expressing frustration at the very couple Netflix had bet its reputation on. Meghan and Harry weren't just another content deal. They were Netflix's royal coup, the deal that defined an era. And if Sarandos now felt deceived, that's not just awkward. That's catastrophic. But why did Sarandos say it? Why break the silence now? That's the mystery. Some Hollywood insiders suggest it wasn't accidental at all, that it was calculated. Sarandos, after all, doesn't blurt. Every word he speaks is weighed, deliberate, and purposeful. So what was the purpose here? Was it to signal to Wall Street that Netflix wouldn't tolerate manipulation? Was it to distance the company from mounting criticism of the Sussex documentary? Or was it, perhaps, a personal admission that Netflix had been burned? Here's where it gets interesting. The Netflix boss is not in the business of emotional confessions. If he said, "They lied to us," then it was more than just a slip of frustration. It was strategy. In Hollywood, silence is power, but breaking silence? That's a warning shot. It tells rivals, investors, and partners that something has shifted. And boy, did things shift. The moment Sarandos' words began circulating, Hollywood insiders took note. Studios that once saw Meghan and Harry as hot properties began to hesitate. Agents who once bragged about connections to the Sussexes grew quiet. It wasn't just about Sarandos. It was about what he represented. The most powerful streaming executive in the world calling into question the credibility of his own star partners. Do you see the scale of this? It's not just a dispute over a documentary. It's about whether two of the most famous people on Earth can still be trusted by the very industry they sought refuge in. And yet, Sarandos wasn't just frustrated with the Sussexes. Reports suggest he felt Netflix itself had been manipulated, that the company's global reputation, its credibility as a purveyor of truth in documentary storytelling, had been put at risk. "We were misled," he allegedly said. "We. Not me. Not they. We." He was speaking for Netflix, for the brand, for the entire corporation that staked its credibility on Meghan and Harry's story. Imagine the implications. A single sentence from Sarandos carries more weight than 1,000 tabloid stories. Investors listen. Shareholders listen. Competitors listen. And the Sussexes? You better believe they listen, too. Now, here's the irony. Meghan and Harry's entire strategy was built on controlling the narrative. They left the royal family because, as they claimed, they wanted to tell their own story on their own terms. They signed with Netflix to do just that. But if the very company that gave them that platform now suggests their story wasn't honest, that's not just losing the narrative. That's watching the narrative turn against you. So here's the question I'll put to you. If Netflix, with all its resources, fact-checkers, and executives, feels it was misled, what does that say about the Sussexes story? Was it ever about truth? Or was it always about performance? And the most chilling part? Sarandos' words may only be the beginning. Because once the boss speaks, the floodgates often open. Insiders feel freer to talk. Leaks become harder to contain. And if Netflix really believes it was manipulated, then the story is far from over. That's the cliffhanger. Ted Sarandos didn't just break his silence. He cracked open a door. And what lies behind it could shatter the carefully built image Meghan and Harry have spent years defending. Because if the most powerful man in streaming feels betrayed, what happens next could be the end of their Hollywood dream. And no one, not even Meghan Markle herself, may be able to spin it away. Were Netflix subscribers served fact, or were they fed fiction dressed up as truth? That is the question executives quietly began asking after the dust settled from the Sussexes' headline-grabbing documentary. For months, Netflix had marketed Harry and Meghan as the unfiltered truth, the couple's raw story told in their own words. But behind the scenes, doubts started to creep in. It began with small details. A dramatic clip of paparazzi swarming was revealed to have come not from Harry and Meghan's life, but from a completely different event. Another sequence claimed to show relentless press intrusion, but eagle-eyed viewers quickly pointed out the footage was years old and unrelated. Fact-checkers pounced, exposing inconsistencies across news outlets and social media. For Netflix, a platform that prides itself on shaping global narratives, this was more than embarrassing. It was a potential credibility crisis. Imagine the scene inside Netflix's offices. Teams of researchers and legal staff cross-referencing footage, checking sources, weighing the optics. Questions flew across boardroom tables. Were these exaggerations, honest mistakes, or deliberate distortions? The answers weren't clear, but the damage was. Audiences no longer trusted every tear, every pause, every claim. And if audiences lose trust, they stop watching with sympathy. They start watching with suspicion. This was the turning point. What had been marketed as history began to look more like a performance. Even worse, the very thing that made the Sussexes so valuable, their promise of honesty, of truth against the monarchy, was being called into question. "They lied to us. We were misled," Sarandos reportedly said, voicing what many executives were already whispering. Let's stop here and ask, why would Meghan and Harry risk exaggerating anything? Weren't their lived experiences dramatic enough? Perhaps. But here's the contradiction. Hollywood rewards spectacle. Bigger drama sells. Tears alone aren't enough. There must be villains, betrayals, larger-than-life showdowns. And what better villain than the centuries-old monarchy itself? In chasing cinematic drama, did the Sussexes push their truth into the realm of fiction? And here's where the irony deepens. The royal family has long been accused of controlling narratives, of hiding uncomfortable truths. Meghan and Harry position themselves as rebels against that system. But if Netflix now suspects the couple of manipulating their own story, doesn't that make them guilty of the very thing they condemned? Executives couldn't ignore it. Shareholders worried about reputational risk. Producers feared for Netflix's standing in the crowded documentary market. Rival studios whispered about the dangers of working with the Sussexes. Each new revelation about exaggerated claims chipped away at the glossy exterior Meghan and Harry had built. But perhaps the most dangerous impact wasn't inside Netflix. It was with the public. Viewers who once felt compassion now felt played. People who defended Meghan against royal critics started asking uncomfortable questions. And once doubt sets in, it spreads like wildfire. One insider reportedly said, "We thought we were getting unfiltered truth. What we got was curated drama." That single line captures the heart of the issue. Was Netflix sold a documentary, or a fairy tale with strategic villains and heroes? And just when Netflix thought it couldn't get worse, internal reviews suggested more discrepancies. Staff tasked with cross-checking sources came back uneasy. Some stories didn't fully align. Some quotes lacked corroboration. And slowly, frustration boiled over. This wasn't just about a show anymore. It was about integrity. Because in the cutthroat world of streaming, trust isn't just nice to have, it's survival. Netflix can't afford to be seen as a platform that allows manipulation to masquerade as fact. Sarandos knew this, which is why his words carried so much weight. They weren't just about Meghan and Harry. They were about Netflix's very brand. So here's the cliffhanger. As Netflix began digging deeper, fact-checking claims, and questioning motives, they realized something unsettling. The Sussex story they paid for might not be the story they got. And the revelations waiting in the wings would leave executives not just frustrated, but furious. Because what they uncovered next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Boardrooms in Los Gatos, California, were supposed to be filled with champagne toasts and victory laps after Harry and Meghan dropped. But instead of celebration, something darker began to creep in. Behind closed doors, the mood shifted. What had started as Netflix's crowning glory was slowly morphing into a credibility nightmare. And make no mistake, the fallout wasn't just about public opinion. It was about the trust, reputation, and pride of one of the most powerful media companies in the world. Picture it. Long tables, sharp suits, executives scrolling through social media feeds filled with criticism. Some staffers quietly vented that they had been sold a one-sided story. Others worried aloud that fact-checkers were tearing the series apart faster than PR could patch it up. The glow of record-breaking viewership headlines couldn't mask the uncomfortable truth. Netflix itself was under fire for pushing a narrative that now seemed, at best, incomplete, at worst, manipulated. Have you ever noticed how quickly enthusiasm can sour when expectations aren't met? Inside Netflix, that's exactly what happened. In the early days, Meghan and Harry had been treated like prized assets. Executives pitched ideas, staff fought to be assigned to their projects, and the Sussex name carried an aura of invincibility. But after the documentary aired, the chatter in those same hallways shifted. Did we get played? Became the unspoken question. The phrase one-sided narrative began surfacing during meetings. Executives weren't just worried about inaccuracies, they were worried about being used. In Hollywood, perception is everything. If Netflix looked like a platform that could be manipulated by celebrities, what would that mean for future projects? What would that mean for its global brand? And here's the irony. Netflix didn't expect balance in the traditional sense. They knew Meghan and Harry had an agenda. They knew the documentary would skew sympathetic. But what they hadn't counted on was the extent to which critics, viewers, and even internal staff would feel duped. One insider reportedly said, "We signed up for their truth, not their script." Sarandos himself, usually the calm center of Netflix's storm, couldn't ignore it. The deal had become more liability than asset. Viewership had delivered short-term wins, yes, but the long-term damage loomed larger. Investors began to ask difficult questions. Was this worth it? Was the Sussex brand still viable? And perhaps most importantly, would Netflix do business with them again? Now imagine the private conversations happening between Sarandos and his closest advisors. The embarrassment wasn't just that critics caught factual slip-ups. It was that Netflix, the giant of the streaming world, the company that prides itself on being smarter, sharper, and bolder than its rivals, had been caught flat-footed. That hurt. And inside those walls, frustration turned into anger. Staff morale shifted too. For some, the Sussex deal had been a career highlight. Now, whispers of disappointment and betrayal filled hushed conversations. Some wondered if other projects with Meghan and Harry should even go forward. Others quietly admitted they wished the company had never signed the couple at all. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. Netflix had a choice to make. Double down and hope the Sussexes could redeem themselves with future projects, or quietly start pulling back, distancing the company from the brand it once flaunted. For Sarandos, it wasn't just about Meghan and Harry anymore. It was about setting a precedent. Allowing this level of manipulation, if true, could tarnish every other documentary under the Netflix banner. And so, the fallout became more than gossip. It became strategy. Netflix began running damage control, softening its internal stance while carefully signaling to the outside world that it would not be duped again. But the question lingered in every conversation. How do you recover when the stars of your most expensive documentary may have used you to rewrite history on their own terms? That's the cliffhanger. Because Netflix's frustration wasn't contained in boardrooms. Soon, the whispers would escape into Hollywood itself. And when an industry built on relationships starts to sense betrayal, the dominoes fall quickly. What happened next would spread far beyond Netflix's walls, reaching producers, studios, and agents who once lined up to work with Meghan and Harry. And it would not end well. When Netflix sneezes, Hollywood catches a cold. And when Netflix's CEO reportedly muttered that Meghan Markle and Prince Harry had misled the company, the ripple effects shot through the entire entertainment industry like a shockwave. Deals are not made in isolation in this town. Reputation is currency, and once whispers start, agents, producers, and studios all listen. At first, the Sussexes' partnership with Netflix had been the hottest property in town. Hollywood insiders couldn't stop talking about it. The royals have gone Hollywood, they said, imagining blockbuster documentaries, polished dramas, and a lucrative future for Meghan and Harry as producers. Meghan's friends in the industry championed her as a trailblazer, while Harry's royal title alone guaranteed global intrigue. It was a perfect storm. But after Sarando's silence broke, the narrative began to shift. Suddenly, the glitter started to fade. The very same industry that had welcomed Meghan and Harry with red carpets and open wallets started to hesitate. Why? Because nobody in Hollywood wants to be tied to a brand accused of exaggeration, manipulation, or dishonesty. Ask yourself, how fast can allies become skeptics when credibility is questioned? The answer is, overnight. Agents began whispering that perhaps the Sussexes weren't bankable anymore. Producers who once saw gold in the royal brand now worried they'd be pouring millions into projects that would spark backlash instead of acclaim. Even streaming rivals like Disney, Amazon, and Apple, who had once considered their own deals with Meghan and Harry, reportedly cooled off. Too risky, one executive was said to have muttered in a trade magazine. And here's where it cuts even deeper. Hollywood thrives on perception, and perception spreads like wildfire. Meghan and Harry's brand had been built on authenticity. But if Netflix, the very company that paid them to be authentic, now questioned that authenticity, what message did that send to everyone else? Think about the irony. The couple left the royal family claiming they wanted to be free to tell their story. Yet, in Hollywood, storytellers live and die by credibility. If your story is doubted, your career is doubted. And slowly, that's what began happening to Meghan and Harry. Industry gossip turned from glowing praise to cautious distance. Invitations dried up. Former allies who had proudly attached their names to the Sussexes began to step back. Hollywood, always watching, always calculating, smelled weakness. And weakness, in this town, is fatal. Even worse, Meghan and Harry found themselves boxed in by their own brand. Their biggest selling point had been their royal past. But you can't milk the same story forever. And without Netflix's unwavering support, the question became, what else did they really have to offer? A podcast that fizzled. a children's series that never materialized. Hollywood began tallying their failures against their one big success, and the scales didn't look flattering. And yet, the industry doesn't just walk away, it gossips. Quiet dinners in Beverly Hills, late-night calls between producers, hushed whispers on studio lots. Netflix says they were lied to. In a world where image is everything, that kind of phrase is poison. So here's the chilling reality. The Sussexes thought Netflix was their Hollywood anchor. But when Netflix began to pull back, the entire industry shifted with it. Their allies shrank. Their opportunities narrowed. And in the cutthroat world of entertainment, once you're seen as a liability, the doors that once swung wide open suddenly slam shut. That's the cliffhanger. Because while Hollywood's hesitation was already dangerous, it wasn't the worst of it. The real threat wasn't in Los Angeles boardrooms. It was across the ocean. Because as Netflix stumbled under the weight of criticism, Buckingham Palace was quietly taking notes. And what came next would pit Meghan and Harry not just against Hollywood, but against the very institution they thought they'd escaped forever. The viewers who once tuned in with wide-eyed curiosity were no longer leaning forward in sympathy. They were crossing their arms in suspicion. What had been sold as the Sussexes' truth was now being picked apart, line by line, claim by claim, in the unforgiving court of public opinion. And make no mistake, this wasn't just idle chatter on social media. It was a full-blown revolt. Twitter threads dissected inconsistencies with forensic precision. TikToks went viral showing side-by-side comparisons of claims versus reality. Headlines began shifting tone from breathless anticipation to pointed skepticism. Questions raised over accuracy in Sussex documentary. Even fans who had defended Meghan and Harry against the harshest royal critics started admitting they felt uneasy. "I supported them," one viewer tweeted, "but this feels exaggerated." And here's the kicker. Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from those who once believed. Audiences who had cried during Meghan's revelations now felt misled. People who had defended Harry's grievances against the monarchy began to wonder if they themselves had been manipulated. Do you see the irony here? The Sussexes, who had built their brand on exposing lies within the royal family, were now accused of bending the truth in their own storytelling. Inside Netflix, the panic wasn't just about critics. It was about subscribers. Streaming giants live and die by trust. And when millions of paying customers start doubting your integrity, it's not just about one documentary. It's about the entire brand. Imagine executives watching viewership stats climb while audience sentiment plummeted. A paradox. The show was being watched, but increasingly, it was being hate-watched. People weren't tuning in to be inspired. They were tuning in to catch the Sussexes in contradictions. And what happens when the very people who amplify your content, the audience, begin mocking it? Memes spread faster than press releases. Parody videos gained traction. Late-night hosts joked about inconsistencies. Slowly but surely, Harry and Meghan became less of a cultural triumph and more of a cultural punchline. Now pause for a second. Doesn't that sound eerily familiar? Think back to the couple's relationship with the British tabloids. At first, coverage was glowing. Then, the tide turned. Praise morphed into criticism, criticism into ridicule. History, it seemed, was repeating itself. Only this time, not in the UK, but in the very Hollywood industry Meghan and Harry thought would be their safe haven. Netflix couldn't ignore it. Executives faced a nightmare scenario, a blockbuster that undermined credibility. Investors asked hard questions. Staff wondered aloud if the Sussex deal had been a mistake. And all the while, the online chorus grew louder. They lied. They exaggerated. They played us. So let me ask you, can Meghan and Harry ever recover from that? Can you rebuild trust once millions feel deceived? And here's where it gets even darker. Just as Netflix was scrambling to manage the fallout, another storm began to brew. Across the ocean, behind palace walls, the royal family was watching, silently, carefully, strategically. They saw the backlash. They saw the cracks forming. And for an institution that thrives on patience, the timing couldn't have been more perfect. That's the cliffhanger. Because just when Netflix thought they were dealing with a PR nightmare in Hollywood, another battle was about to erupt. One far more dangerous, one far more calculated. The royals were preparing to strike back. And when they did, the Sussexes would discover that this time, their Hollywood allies might not be there to shield them. This wasn't a rant. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. This was a chess move. Ted Sarandos, the man who built Netflix into the most powerful streaming empire in the world, doesn't just speak. He signals. And when he allegedly said, "They lied to us, we were misled," it wasn't an outburst. It was strategy. Hollywood insiders immediately understood. Sarandos was sending a message, not just to Meghan and Harry, not just to his staff, but to Wall Street, to Hollywood, and to every future celebrity who thought they could use Netflix as a mouthpiece. His words were a line in the sand. A warning: Netflix is not a stage for unchecked propaganda. Why now? Timing is everything. By the time whispers of Sarandos' frustration surfaced, Netflix was under pressure. Subscriber growth had slowed. Investors wanted confidence, not controversy. Awards season loomed, and credibility mattered more than clicks. If Netflix looked complicit in exaggeration, it risked more than embarrassment. It risked losing the very prestige that justifies billion-dollar budgets. And let's not forget, Sarandos has played this game before. He's navigated scandals, backlash, even political storms. He knows how to use silence as armor, and when to break it like a blade. So when he broke it here, it was calculated. He wasn't just distancing Netflix from Meghan and Harry. He was repositioning Netflix itself as the victim. They lied to us. We were misled. With those words, Sarandos shifted the blame, deflecting criticism from his company and placing it squarely on the Sussexes' shoulders. Think about the brilliance of that. For months, critics had accused Netflix of pushing a one-sided narrative. Now, with a single phrase, Sarandos reframed the story. Netflix wasn't the manipulator, it was the manipulated. Suddenly, the Sussexes weren't the victims. They were the suspects. But here's the twist. Sarandos didn't shout it from a stage. He didn't issue a press release. He let it leak. He let Hollywood gossip mills carry the quote, whisper it across boardrooms, repeat it at cocktail parties. That's how power works here. Plausible deniability on the surface, devastating impact underneath. Everyone heard the words. No one could quite pin them down. And the damage spread faster than any official statement ever could. Do you see the genius here? By saying so little, he said everything. And Meghan and Harry? They had no playbook for this. They built their brand on being louder, more emotional, more dramatic than the institutions they fought against. But how do you fight someone who doesn't shout, who doesn't posture, who simply drops a quiet phrase that flips the narrative on its head? Here's another layer to consider: investors. By signaling Netflix was misled, Sarandos reassured Wall Street that the company wasn't complicit, that any damage to credibility wasn't systemic, but external. It was the Sussexes' fault, not Netflix's. In a single stroke, he defended the brand and isolated the problem. And for Meghan and Harry, that isolation was deadly. Hollywood runs on relationships, and Sarandos' words made them radioactive. If Netflix, the company that gave them their biggest stage, felt deceived, who else in Hollywood would take the risk? Agents heard the message. Studios heard the message. Even potential allies understood. Sarandos had spoken, and the Sussexes' stock was falling fast. So here's the cliffhanger. Sarandos didn't just vent frustration. He executed a move that redefined the entire playing field. And while Meghan and Harry scrambled to control the fallout, Hollywood insiders were already asking a brutal question. Was this the moment Netflix quietly began cutting the Sussexes loose? What came next would answer that, and it would be devastating. The Sussexes had always controlled their narrative. From Oprah's interview to magazine spreads, from podcasts to their Netflix series, Meghan and Harry set the terms. They decided what to reveal, when to reveal it, and how it would be framed. But when Ted Sarandos broke his silence, even in whispers, that power slipped through their fingers. Suddenly, they weren't leading the story. They were reacting to it. And for a couple who built their empire on narrative control, that was catastrophic. In Hollywood, timing is everything. The reports of Sarandos' comments didn't explode with a dramatic press conference. They leaked. Quietly, strategically, devastatingly. A phrase like, "they lied to us, we were misled," doesn't need to be shouted to cause damage. It seeps. It spreads. And once it's out there, silence becomes louder than any response. So what did Meghan and Harry do? That's the question that has haunted insiders. Publicly, they remained quiet. Archwell, their organization, issued no fiery denials. Meghan didn't stage a glamorous interview to counter the narrative. Harry didn't release an angry statement. Instead, There was nothing. And in Hollywood, nothing often means panic. Behind closed doors, insiders whisper that Meghan's PR advisors debated furiously. Should they counterattack, claiming Netflix was scapegoating them? Should they double down on their truth brand? Or would silence buy them time? But every day they hesitated, the gossip spread. Hollywood doesn't like uncertainty. If you don't control your story, the town writes it for you. Here's the irony. The couple who once accused the monarchy of briefing against them now faced the same suspicion in Los Angeles. Was Netflix briefing against them? Were they being positioned as the villains to protect the brand? The parallels were striking, and for Meghan especially, the sting must have been brutal. She had traded one palace for another, Buckingham for Hollywood, only to find herself cornered again. And what about Harry? Friends suggest he was caught in a bind. He had tied his name, his reputation, and his new life to Meghan's Hollywood ambitions. But Netflix wasn't just Meghan's project, it was his too. To see their credibility questioned by the very platform they relied on left him conflicted. Some say Harry wanted to fight back. Others say he preferred to stay quiet, hoping the storm would pass. But storms don't pass in Hollywood. They intensify. The longer Meghan and Harry said nothing, the more their silence was interpreted as guilt. If it isn't true, industry insiders asked, why not deny it? That question spread like wildfire, from gossip columns to investor calls. Archwell tried to pivot, focusing on other projects. But here's the problem. When your flagship partnership is crumbling, everything else feels smaller. Their podcast deal had already fizzled. Their scripted projects hadn't materialized. The Netflix fallout loomed larger than anything they could announce. And without a counterpunch, the couple looked weak. So here's where it gets truly dangerous for them. Hollywood loyalty is transactional. Allies stick around when you're bankable. But when you look like a liability, even friends fade away. Slowly, invitations dried up. Public appearances grew fewer. Meghan and Harry, who once commanded endless headlines, found themselves increasingly sidelined. Do you see the pattern? They left the monarchy claiming they were silenced. They entered Hollywood claiming they'd found freedom. And now, their silence spoke louder than anything they could say. And here's the cliffhanger. As the couple scrambled to figure out their next move, whispers began circulating that this wasn't just about Netflix. Other companies, other partners, were watching closely. And what they saw made them nervous. Hollywood doors don't slam shut all at once. They creak, they close slowly, until suddenly you realize you're outside. And for Meghan and Harry, that moment may have already begun. It's bigger than Meghan, bigger than Harry, bigger even than Netflix. At the heart of this storm lies a question that shakes the entire streaming industry. Can audiences still trust what they're watching? Think about it. Documentaries have always walked a fine line. They're part journalism, part entertainment. But in recent years, the genre has exploded. Platforms like Netflix sell themselves not just as entertainers, but as truth-tellers. The brand depends on it. And when that trust is shaken, the consequences ripple far beyond one royal couple. The Sussexes documentary was supposed to be Netflix's proof of concept, authentic, raw, historic. Instead, critics accused it of being polished propaganda. The paparazzi footage that didn't match, the anecdotes that didn't add up, the lack of verification for some of the most explosive claims, each one chipped away at credibility. And if Netflix could be misled here, what about all their other so-called documentaries? That's what terrified executives. If one show can make the whole platform look unreliable, then trust in the entire brand begins to erode. And Sarandos knew it. His alleged words weren't just aimed at Harry and Meghan. They were aimed at protecting Netflix itself. They lied to us wasn't just anger. It was insulation. It was him drawing a line and saying, blame them, not us. And audiences were listening. Forums filled with skepticism. Commentators warned that streaming had blurred the line between truth and drama. Some even asked if the Sussex documentary should be reclassified as reality TV instead of documentary. Imagine the humiliation for Netflix. Their royal blockbuster downgraded to the same category as a dating show. But here's where it cuts deeper. Competitors smelled blood. Rivals at Amazon, Hulu, Disney, they all know perception is power. And if Netflix looked like it had been duped, that perception opened the door for others to claim their documentaries were more trustworthy. In a business built on subscribers, that's lethal. Meanwhile, Meghan and Harry's brand took collateral damage. They sold themselves as truth-tellers, survivors breaking free from oppression. But if the platform that gave them their loudest megaphone questions that truth, the entire foundation of Archwell begins to wobble. Because let's be honest, their power doesn't come from talent in acting or filmmaking. It comes from their story. And if the story is in doubt, so is everything else. Here's the contradiction. Meghan and Harry thought Hollywood would free them from the monarchy's control. But Hollywood runs on its own rules, and credibility is king. Once you lose it, you're done. And Sarandos knew it wasn't just about optics. It was about business. Netflix's value is built on being trusted to deliver real stories, even when dramatized. If subscribers start doubting that, they cancel. Investors panic. The stock dips. That's why Sarandos spoke. He wasn't just expressing frustration. He was defending the entire house of cards. Now pause. Ask yourself this. Can streaming giants ever truly tell the truth when celebrities control the narrative? Or are we all being sold polished fiction disguised as fact? That's the cliffhanger. Because Netflix may have protected its brand for now, but Meghan and Harry? Their empire was built on the fragile promise of authenticity. And as Netflix tightened its grip, the couple found themselves standing on shakier ground than ever before, with their entire Hollywood future hanging in the balance. Follow the money. Because in Hollywood, it always tells the truth. Strip away the glitz, the headlines, the emotional monologues, and what remains is a balance sheet. And when it came to Meghan and Harry's deal with Netflix, those numbers started raising alarms. On paper, the Sussexes partnership looked like a triumph. Harry and Meghan generated massive viewership. Netflix bragged about record-breaking numbers in its press releases. But here's the uncomfortable truth executives wrestled with. High viewership doesn't always equal high return. Subscribers who joined to watch the Sussexes didn't always stick around. And the wave of controversy that followed? That didn't translate into prestige. It translated into risk. Consider the breakdown. The Sussexes signed a deal reportedly worth up to $100 million. For that, Netflix expected a slate of projects, documentaries, scripted shows, children's programming. Grand promises. But what actually materialized? One major docuseries, Harry's Heart of Invictus, and scattered announcements that fizzled. Where was the big-budget children's show Meghan once teased? Where were the original films, the scripted dramas, the long-term hits? The output didn't match the investment. And Hollywood is merciless with math. If you spend $100 million, you expect 10 times that in cultural impact, subscribers gained, and prestige secured. Instead, Netflix found itself defending the integrity of a single documentary while other projects sputtered. That's not ROI. That's embarrassment disguised as entertainment. Ask yourself, if you were Netflix, would you renew that deal? Would you pour millions more into a brand that sparked backlash, damaged credibility, and delivered less content than promised? Behind closed doors, those very questions were asked. Financial analysts quietly raised eyebrows. Shareholders weren't convinced the Sussex deal had been worth it. Even industry insiders began using a phrase dreaded in Hollywood: bad investment. And when that phrase attaches itself to a star, or in this case, a royal couple, the fallout is brutal. It wasn't just about money lost. It was about money scared away. Advertisers started hesitating. Sponsors looked at the Sussexes and saw risk. Even charities became cautious, worried about aligning too closely with a brand accused of stretching the truth. Financial consequences ripple. One lost deal leads to another. One whisper of toxic becomes a chorus. And here's where it gets devastating. Without Netflix's unwavering backing, what's left of Meghan and Harry's Hollywood dream? Spotify had already cut ties, bluntly ending their deal after one underperforming podcast. Other platforms weren't knocking down the door. Without Netflix, the Sussexes would be forced to rely on smaller deals, speaking engagements, or book contracts, none of which carried the same global impact or prestige. The numbers didn't just weaken the Sussexes' Hollywood standing. They humiliated them. Imagine signing the biggest royal streaming deal in history, only to have the world ask, was it worth it? Did Netflix get played? Did Meghan and Harry cash in on their royal names and leave Netflix holding the bill? So here's the cliffhanger. As the financial reality set in, Netflix executives began preparing for the inevitable. And Meghan and Harry were about to learn the coldest truth of all. In Hollywood, loyalty lasts only as long as the money flows. What came next would prove that allies bought with cash can vanish overnight. Those who once toasted Meghan and Harry's freedom with champagne flutes were now whispering doubts in dimly lit corners of Beverly Hills. The same celebrities and media allies who had hailed the couple as cultural icons began to rethink their loyalties. In Hollywood, where reputations rise and fall faster than box office weekends, the Sussexes suddenly looked less like revolutionary truth-tellers and more like liabilities. At the beginning, it was intoxicating. Oprah gave them the biggest stage on earth. Tyler Perry offered his mansion as sanctuary. Serena Williams, Beyoncé, and a string of A-list friends lined up to show support. Meghan and Harry weren't just royals anymore. They were Hollywood's newest darlings. But alliances in this industry are transactional. And when Netflix, the Sussexes' most powerful backer, started signaling dissatisfaction, those alliances began to fracture. Imagine the quiet conversations. A producer once eager to pitch a Sussex project now saying, "Maybe we wait." An agent whispering to a client, "Aligning with them might not help your brand right now." Even celebrities who once praised Meghan's courage began to go silent, wary of being tied to a couple accused of exaggeration. Hollywood thrives on momentum, and the Sussexes' momentum was slipping. The betrayal stung. Meghan, who had positioned herself as the industry insider, the American actress who married into royalty and brought the palace to Hollywood's doorstep, now found herself facing the same whispers she had once lobbed at Buckingham Palace. Manipulative, controlling, unreliable. Those words don't just damage a reputation. They destroy trust. And here's the cruel irony. The Sussexes had built their power on relationships. They didn't have a Marvel franchise. They didn't have a catalog of best-selling films. They had friends, networks, and public sympathy. But when those friends sensed risk, they did what Hollywood always does. They protected themselves. Slowly, allies turned into critics. Take the media, for example. Outlets that once ran glowing profiles now ran skeptical headlines. The British press had always been critical, but now even U.S. outlets began to question the Sussex narrative. A dangerous shift. Because once American media cools, the Hollywood ecosystem follows. And let's not forget the whispers from within. Some who worked on the Netflix project reportedly described clashes with Meghan and Harry behind the scenes. Creative control became a battlefield. Producers felt managed rather than collaborative. One insider allegedly quipped, "It felt less like making a documentary and more like staging a campaign video." If that's what allies thought privately, imagine what skeptics were ready to say publicly. Now pause. Do you see the cycle here? The couple who fled the monarchy claiming betrayal were now facing betrayal themselves. The Sussexes accused the palace of briefing against them. Now Hollywood whispered against them. They claimed the royals left them isolated. Now Hollywood's elites were doing the same. History, repeating itself in brutal irony. And what about Sarandos? His alleged comments gave permission for others to speak. If Netflix's boss could question the Sussexes, why couldn't everyone else? The floodgates opened. Gossip turned to criticism. Once whispered doubts became public. That's the cliffhanger. Because as allies slipped away, Meghan and Harry's circle grew smaller. And in Hollywood, isolation is the death knell of relevance. The couple who once seemed untouchable were suddenly vulnerable. And the question hung in the air. If even their friends were stepping back, who would still stand with them when the storm got worse? Every empire falls. The only question is, how fast? For Meghan and Harry, the cracks in their Hollywood kingdom were beginning to look like fault lines, and Sarandos' words were the tremor that threatened to bring the whole structure down. Without Netflix's unconditional support, their entire future in the industry was up for grabs. Think about it. What's left for them if the streaming giant that made their biggest splash now feels deceived? Spotify had already slammed the door shut, pulling the plug on their multi-million-dollar podcast deal after one disappointing season. Archwell Audio was supposed to rival the biggest names in podcasting, but instead, it fizzled into silence. That was strike one. Netflix wobbling? That's strike two. And in Hollywood, you don't often get a third chance. So what does the future look like for the Sussexes? Let's break it down. Their core selling point, their royal status, is a double-edged sword. It gave them global attention, yes, but it also tethered them to palace drama they can't escape. Every project they pitch comes back to one thing: their ties to the monarchy. But how many times can you tell the same story before people stop listening? The royal card can only be played so many times, and Hollywood knows it.